On the other hand, we have the kind of representation that's typical of the capitalist democracies, of the parliamentary democracies. Weber calls it a free representation. He means that the representatives are free to act on their will at these periodic intervals between elections. But the third type is what interests me for this. He calls it patriarchal representation, and he describes it as the kind of way that the feudal lord represents the peasants of the estate. Of course, the peasants don't elect the feudal lord, but in some sense, the feudal lord does represent their interests. I think it's in that way, increasingly, we see representation functioning in the global system. It seems to be a way of characterizing what the crisis, the newly exacerbated crisis of democracy we're seeing on the global scale is. So this is the way I would say that George Bush represents the entire global population. You could also say that the IMF represents the various nations that obey its regulations. So that the IMF represents Argentina by a kind of patriarchal representation. You know, there's no, in the same way that or you could say, if you come from a different context than thinking of the European feudal system, it's the way also that the slaveholder represents the slaves. The slaveholder does represent the slaves, but not through, or another example I was thinking of is these beauty pageants. I mean, Miss North Carolina, she represents North Carolina. She may be even elected. But it's that kind of representation that we're seeing increasingly on a global scale, this kind of patriarchal representation that, in my mind, is one way of grasping the exacerbated crisis of democracy through this crisis of representation. So when Tony and I developed this theory of empire to try to explain what the power system is today, and I'll try to explain that in a minute, but I wanted to contextualize it this way because I think that one way of understanding it is an attempt to describe this global system that solidifies the crisis of democracy. That in fact, empire is the primary obstacle to the possibilities of democracy today. And here's what we mean by it. Let me give you the short version of what we mean by empire. Yeah, so empire is a global form of rule, meaning also as the systematic view of the crisis of democracy. What we mean by empire is this, that when we recognize in these processes of globalization that the sovereignty of nation states, of subordinate nation states obviously, but even of the dominant nation states, is lowering in many respects. That doesn't mean that sovereignty as such is declining. That doesn't mean that political control as such is declining. Our hypothesis, rather, is that sovereignty is taking a new form. And that it's this form, this properly global form of sovereignty that we're calling empire. We think of that, in fact, it's good to have a first caution. In many of these discussions about globalization and politics, there are two people, and the one person says, nation states are still important, therefore there is no globalization. And the other person says, but there is globalization, therefore nation states no longer matter. And I think they're both wrong. What one has to try to think is the way that nation states, of course some more than others, still function as instruments and agents of control. They do so within a larger system. And that's what we're trying to understand by empire, is the larger, properly global political system in which nation states function. Precisely like this, we're trying to think empire as a kind of network sovereignty. And what we mean by this is that a coordination or a concert among a large series of powers that are distinct, but nonetheless that function together. So that, for instance, we'd have a network that consists of the dominant nation states, of course the US first among them. It doesn't mean that they're all equal, but the dominant nation states, in some sense, functioning together. The dominant capitalist corporations functioning along with this. Supranational economic organizations like the IMF or the World Bank. Even the WTO is a kind of intersection among the nation states. Even the various non-governmental organizations, some different than others, that these various powers functioning together construct a new form of sovereignty. Construct a form of sovereignty that's properly global and is capable of guaranteeing global order. That might be one way of saying it. Another way of posing this whole question is, you know, okay, there is globalization. What is the political order of globalization? And that's what we're trying to answer with this. once I say that, it should be clear, I think, or at least it's clear to me, that what we're trying to describe here, this new form of sovereignty that we're calling empire, somewhat awkwardly, is different than the traditional European imperialisms. Because properly thinking in terms of sovereignty, what imperialism means, in a very limited but nonetheless real sense, what imperialism is the imposition of the national sovereignty of one country over a foreign territory. So the British imperialism is properly the imposition of British national sovereignty over India, perhaps with colonial regimes, perhaps not, the imposition over Argentina through financial mechanisms, etc. That's what imperialism was. It was based on national sovereignty. What we're arguing is in the process of formation today is rather not simply the imposition of national sovereignty over foreign territory, but rather the construction of a properly global sovereign force, sovereign power, that includes the various national powers in a kind of network. Now, one peculiarity of this mode of argumentation that I should point out is that we think of this as a tendency of the process of the formation of empire. In other words, we're, in a way, claiming to recognize, we think we are recognizing a tendency within the present, and then we are analyzing, in fact, the completed form. It's an odd argument, I think a useful one, but nonetheless, you could criticize it too. It's very similar, just to recognize the kind of thing we're doing, it's very similar, it seems to me, to what Marx does in Capital, in the books Capital. What Marx is doing, of course, in 1860, 1850, when he's writing the books, capitalist production is a small fraction of the English economy at that time. It's a much smaller fraction of the European economy and the global economy. You don't talk about it. But what he's saying is that there's a tendency of the formation of a capitalist society based on this small segment. He's claiming a leading segment of the economy. And so what he does in the books is read the completely formed capitalist society. He's making an analysis based on the free movement of labor across society, various other things that are assuming a kind of completed form. We're doing something like that too. We're saying there is a process today of this formation of empire, and we're trying to read the completed form. Part of the complications of this come up with a first and very rational objection to our hypothesis. And this takes most complete form, it seems to me, in terms of the Iraq War, the present Iraq War. And it goes something like this, or this is the best form of it, seems to me. A friend of mine, Tariq Ali, editor of New Left Review and constant critic of the US war in Iraq and etc., other things. He started giving these speeches around March 2003, right at the time of the victory of Baghdad. And he started all of these speeches somewhat comically. It seemed like a good start for him, but it was referring to us where he says, Bush and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld, they made this war in Iraq in order to prove empire wrong, like to prove our book wrong. Which is like a compliment in a way, but it's sort of a twisted compliment, because he says they're proving empire wrong by demonstrating imperialism, thanks very much, is alive and well. Because the US can, just like the definitions I was saying before, the US can impose its national sovereignty over foreign territory. It can occupy a country, it can transform its economy, transform its politics. That's imperialism. And Tariq's right. That is the ideology. This is what I think that mentally Bush and Wolfowitz and their crew are, in fact, thinking in old-fashioned imperialist terms. They are imagining that the US can conduct. I mean, unilateralism means something slightly different, but it's pretty close to this notion of imperialism. And so I think Tariq's right. So he says, look, Michael and Tony, it's all very nice theoretically, but obviously it's false, because the US is proving it false. It's not a new global order that's some sort of a network power. It's US imperialism, pure and simple, like it used to be. The thing is, with that kind of evidence, 2 years later, 2.5 years later, 2.5 years after the victory of Baghdad, that little war's not looking so good. It's not, they're in fact it's proving to be a failure. I mean, a failure not only for the 100,000 Iraqi dead, however many thousand Iraqi dead, it's a failure precisely from the perspective of its authors. It's not proven either. In fact, it's proven to be a failure in being able to remake a political system, remake an economic system. They haven't been able to create stable markets for profit. They haven't even been able to create stable order.